the engagement, you've got the wedding, and then you've got all the fuss with regard to the reception and who's going to sit with whom, and the parents' interference with regard to that, and all those kind of things, which can be very stressful for couples. And particularly when they come and have their children, we'll talk about this with baptism, where the grandparents then want to impose their views on what happens with the children. So recognising the importance of a new family unit, of departure from your father and mother, doesn't mean they're no longer your father and mother. So honouring your father and mother in the fifth commandment still has value and reference, the point that Rick made with regard to Adonijah's father, even though he was an adult. So that is still there, but it's a new family unit. The next is the man cleaves to his wife. And the language there of cleaving is a relational language. It's funny, isn't it? The word cleave in English actually has two opposite meanings. A cleave means to come together, but a butcher uses a cleaver to separate things. You ever thought about that? That sense in which cleave here is the uniting of two persons to become one. And that oneness is a relational oneness, a unity between a husband and a wife, and they become one flesh. So that's the weaving, if you like. And the unity in the sexual expression of oneness is a physical symbol of a deeper reality. And so that oneness is there when you're not engaged in sexual intercourse in a marriage. The oneness is still there. That's an expression of it. It's interesting, and that, of course, is what's going to produce children. But there's a unity of feature of the marriage by virtue of the sexual union of the two together as well. And so the two become one flesh. You'll notice in this verse there's no minister. A long time waiting for a minister to come along, wouldn't it? For Adam and Eve. There's no minister because marriage is a covenant between two people. We are sucked into the modern view of marriage, which requires the state or a Christian minister or even a secular celebrant to authorise a marriage. Theologically, two people marry when they go through the leaving, cleaving and weaving. In one sense, the marriage has its consummation in the weaving. The leaving has a public character to it. What makes it different from two people living together is the commitment of one to the other. And the commitment is in the leaving. Is different from an affair. In one sense, I suppose, a couple living together may consider themselves married, and I suppose it's kind of, if it's public that they have actually no longer living with their parents or independent, but they're living together in the one house or in the one bed, there's a certain public character that they allow living together. But it lacks the sense in which we are living together now as one, because the commitment is not there. And that commitment is the essence of a relationship in terms of the cleaving. So that middle concept of leaving, cleaving, weaving, the cleaving, I take it, is the unity of one, which is those whom God has joined together, let no one put asunder, to use Jesus' words, reflecting on this verse. So, in one sense, a couple you could theologically consider a couple, if they've actually made promises to one another and demonstrated that, then there is a ground on which you could say they're married, and that was the case through ancient civilisations. You realise, of course, that in England, the state only took an interest in marriage to make it a formal structure was because of inheritance laws and property issues, and the question of having a bastard children. So that was the way. That's how the state got involved. The church got involved later. It's not till the 10th century that the church gets involved in marriage. Do you realise that? It's actually fairly recent in terms of the history of the church. If you think of the 10th century as recent, but there were 10 centuries up until that point in time and 10 centuries since. So the church had an interest because the church wanted to make sure that people married were legitimate candidates for marriage. And so what you have in the back of the prayer book, as you might recall, is the table of kindred and affinity. Kindred and affinity, the two words with regard to bloodline and in-laws thereof. So the affinity, those which are affiliated with, if you like, that. So you can't marry your brother or your sister. Can't marry your father's wife. That's the affinity side. You see, your father's wife may not be your mother. Your mother may have died, father remarried. You can't marry within those bounds. And it's very interesting, if you think in terms of all those discussions you had at theological college about the ongoing use of the law of the Old Testament for Christian living, it's very interesting. The table of kindred and affinity, the table of kindred and affinity, comes directly out of the law of Moses. And the Reformers see no transition from those bounds of whom you could not marry being transferred into the new covenant. That's another issue, which could be more questions, I'm sure. But you need to recognise that in terms of thinking through how the Reformers saw the relationships under the law of Moses, and clearly there's all kinds of changes from the law of Moses to today, but there's an essence which is there, and that, of course, impacts upon the current debate with regard to same-sex marriage, because marriage is clearly prohibited between two persons of the same sex, because in a sense it's fundamentally opposed to the very creation of woman as coming out of man being complementary and distinct from the man. So here we have this marriage as a covenant, which is really between two people. There's nothing improper about having a minister be there, and I think the value of it is to make sure, one, that the person is not already married. So we're not actually blessing bigamy. That's pretty important. Secondly, that the person is not in one of the prohibited relationships in the table of kindred and affinity. So that is not the case. And so therefore we want to make sure that. So then when you have in the marriage service, you have what's called the fourth ban. If anyone has any reason why these two should not be lawfully married, let him now speak or forever hold his peace. It's called the fourth ban because in English law, when the Book of Common Prayer is there, and it's still the case today, you have three bans read. And a ban is an announcement that two people are going to be married 3 weeks, 2 weeks and 1 week before the wedding, so that people know this is a public matter. And the fourth ban is actually in the service. In Australian culture and society, we no longer have the first three bans, but we've retained the fourth ban, and that is, I know it's easy to snigger in the saying of that, and many a minister will do that, and so will the couple and the congregation, but there is a serious element of recognising the validity of this marriage. It's Jane Eyre, isn't it? If you've read Jane Eyre, she's about to get married, and then someone comes up and says, no, the husband you're marrying is already married and his wife's still alive. So that the fourth ban worked, then the first three obviously didn't. So it's actually an important thing, and you need, in today's society, you've got to be careful how you do it, but I would explain it in some way so that this is important, because only if you're married, only those who are married according to God's law are rightly married. Let me just read to you those words where he says, if any, this is after you've made the opening statement, I require and charge you both as you will answer at the dreadful day of judgment. That puts a weight upon the statements you're about to make to each other. When the secrets of all hearts shall be disclosed, that if either of you know any impediment why you may not be lawfully joined together in matrimony, you do now confess it. For be ye well assured that so many as are coupled together otherwise than God's word doth allow are not joined together by God, neither is their matrimony lawful. So that's the statement that you're making in the marriage service, in a modern form of the marriage service, but the same impact and gravity of what these two people are doing needs to be brought about. The other thing to note is that the prayer book mentions 3 reasons for which matrimony was ordained. Okay? First, it was ordained for the procreation of children to be brought up in the fear and nurture of the Lord and to the praise of his holy name. You may not have thought that procreation was the first thing for marriage. It's very interesting that the prayer book puts it that way. And that is, of course, because Genesis 1 precedes Genesis 2, be fruitful and multiply. And the husband and the wife, or male and female, he made them to be fruitful and multiply, is in chapter 1. And so the prayer book puts it there that this actually has its purpose in the procreation of children. And I think this helps us understand why marriage will no longer be an estate in the new heavens, the new earth. Because there'll be no further procreation. That actually is the ultimate. The marriage will still continue with Christ and his bride, but the procreation will have been completed, certainly at the physical level, in terms of new humans being created by God. Secondly, it was ordained for a remedy against sin and to avoid fornication, that such persons as have not the gift of continency might marry and keep themselves undefiled members of Christ's body. If I have the risk here now of saying that the prayer book has a slight error here, which I pointed out to my bishops when I was getting ordained, not to their great pleasure, the prayer book says it was ordained as a remedy against sin. That, of course, is not true. That's its purpose post-Genesis 3. It's not its purpose pre-Genesis 3. I raised this with Donald Robinson, previous Archbishop of Sydney, and he said that Cranmer was a biblicist rather than a biblical theology theologian, if you know what I mean by that. In other words, he sees 1 Corinthians 7, sees the fact that clearly marriage there is a means of preventing fornication, etc., and rightly so, especially in Corinth. And so Cranmer puts it in the prayer book without thinking of the redemptive historical movement from Genesis 1 and 2 to 1 Corinthians 7 with the rupture of Genesis 3. The marriage serves that purpose today is certainly true. My only quibble with the prayer book here is that it was not ordained for that purpose because there was no sin in the Garden of Eden, and Adam and Eve were not joined together in order to prevent them from sexual immorality or fornication, especially since no one else is around. Anyhow, that's a minor matter, sorry about that. And thirdly, it was ordained for the mutual society, help and comfort that the one ought to have of the other, both in prosperity and adversity, into which the holy estate, these two persons present, come now to be joined. So there is that unity of value. And it's also, notice, it's in the context they help one another, it's for the mutual society, help and comfort that the one would have for the other. So there's a benefit here too for a society as well, but especially for the two. They're the 3 reasons that the prayer book sustains for the purpose of marriage as we have it today. Now, Malachi 2:14 uses the language of covenant. I won't go on further than that, except that the language of covenant, berit is the Hebrew word, is a rich and multiform concept which you can easily ignore and forget that covenant has deep commitments attached to it. And with covenant comes not only commitment but also blessings and cursings and sanctions. And therefore, to break that covenant is a very serious thing. With regard to marriage. And then lastly, Christ and the Church in Ephesians 5:32, which I know you know well, it expresses here, he's talking about the way in which husbands are love their wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Here now is another aspect of the relationship of husbands and wives in marriage, and the way in which that self-service of the husband to the wife is modelled on Christ's sacrifice of himself, giving himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word. Very interesting reflection on baptism and the word of God in that phrase there, so that he might present the church to himself in splendour, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. Even so, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. It's a fascinating reflection upon the ministry of the husband to his wife in loving our own body. The care we have for our own bodies ought to be the care we have for our wives. And so therefore, we know no man hates his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. And for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, 2:24 from Genesis, joined to his wife, the two shall become one. This is a great mystery, and I take it to mean Christ and the church. And it's interesting, my own view is that Christ's relationship to the church is modelled upon marriage with Adam and Eve, and not vice versa. That's controversial because most people think the other way around. I think that the relationship of the love and care that God put in marriage between a husband and a wife, and in my view this is what strengthens the complementarian view of marriage actually, is the way in which Christ cares for his bride, the church, and he's therefore married to us. It is not an egalitarian marriage we have with Christ. It's a complementarian marriage. And he clearly is our head and our ruler and our shepherd, and he does all that he can to care for us, to present us spotless and perfect. It's a high measure when you're coming to prepare people for marriage, to use these verses about even if a couple might have egalitarian views, to actually say, well, this is still the model of the kind of service that a husband, even in an egalitarian relationship, needs to give to the wife. And it is a great mystery to understand that relationship of Christ and his church in a marriage bond, but this, he takes it to mean Christ and the church. Marriage is not a sacrament. As you know, in medieval church, they saw marriage as a sacrament. The Catechism makes it clear that there are only two sacraments, which are what we call dominical sacraments. You'll still get this in various parts of the Anglican Church. People still talk about 7 around the country. They do in different dioceses, regrettably. Colin Buchanan, in his, not the singer, but the theologian, in his commentary on the... well, I'm sorry, he's a theologian, okay. The one who writes in prose rather than poetry. I'm thinking of that Colin Buchanan, okay. The one who doesn't sing along. He says that in the article you might recall that the 7 sacraments commonly called sacraments, and he thinks the word commonly means wrongly. That is, that was the language of commonly, means it was commonly misunderstood. It was wrongly called sacraments. You can reflect upon that if you like. The difference is that the sacrament is for the church. A sacrament is a covenant sign. It's not for all humanity. So baptism, which we'll come to, is not for everyone. The Lord's Supper is not for everyone. Both of those signs and seals are for the people of God. And whereas marriage is for everyone. And that makes it very distinct with regard to, it means that you can marry 2 people. You can marry 2 non-Christians, in my view, because marriage is not only for Christians. What you can't do is marry a Christian and a non-Christian, in my view, because that breaks God's law for Christians. It doesn't mean the marriage wouldn't be a true marriage. It would still be a marriage, but it is not one which God approves. it will not be lawful in his sight. That is controversial. Some people take a different view, but that's my own view, my own reading 1 Corinthians 7. And I think here but we can marry two non-Christians, as long as they're prepared to come and have God's name, have a blessing in God's name pronounced upon them. And many non-Christians are happy to do that. I think that's good for society, that we actually do that, because we want to sanctify their relationship. If you've got and you may well, I don't know what it's like here in the diocese, but in Sydney, many people present for marriage who are already living together. And my view, when I was in Paris and that took place, I was made a point of actually saying publicly in the service, we know these two have been actually enjoying the fruit of marriage prior to this day, but now they want to receive God's blessing upon that marriage. So you don't want the people in the congregation who all know they've been living together for so many years to think they've pulled the wool over the minister's eyes, he doesn't really know. But you need to make that plain. But at the same time, you can say, but God can still bless this marriage. They've now recognised the importance of that public declaration of who they are, and they're making vows publicly, not only in the sight of the congregation, but also in the sight of God. It's a gift for all humanity, that is, for Christians and non-Christians alike. And I don't believe in the language of it's only a real marriage if it's between Christians. No, that's rubbish. It's a real marriage if it's between two image bearers of the opposite sex, permanent and exclusive. When John Howard changed the Marriage Act in 2004, which is less than 12 years ago, got agreement finally from Mark Latham, and it was a bipartisan agreement to change the Marriage Act to actually reflect the teaching of the Bible of being between a man and woman, exclusive and permanent, till death us do part. So it's for all humanity. It's for the gift for society, because it provides the structure for families. That procreation is part of society. A society which doesn't have procreation is going to die. So this is God's plan for humanity that is very interesting. In the animal world, you see most animals, farmers, when animals are born, whether it's calves or dogs or sheep or whatever, giraffes, perhaps you don't have many here, but as soon as they're born, they're up and walking within hours. What human child can do that? There's an extraordinary difference in the human dependency of a baby, a human baby, upon the parents, which is not true in the animal world. And they can be fairly independent within weeks in some cases, or in months. If you go down to fish and things like that in the sea, it's almost instantaneous. Or for turtles coming out of their shells and off they go and into the wild blue sea. So at that level, there's a dependency, because this is God's plan for humanity to nurture relationships. And relationships are the very heart of understanding our society. And therefore relationships are the very heart of a family in terms of procreation, bringing up children. To have children without that family structure will be destructive to our society, which feeds into the later conversations we'll be having with David and Mark later on. Prohibited relationships constitute unholy matrimony. And I think that, I've said this publicly and tend to continue to do so, I think we need to distinguish between holy matrimony and unholy matrimony, especially if our federal government down the track chooses to pass a law which will amend the Marriage Act to allow same-sex marriage. Then we, I believe, need, as Christian ministers, to call a spade and say, yes, the law may call that matrimony, but God calls it, and we shall call it, unholy matrimony. Now that's going to put an edge on things, I know, but the thing is, the law doesn't legislate on holiness. So you're not breaking any law by describing it as unholy. Holiness is a divine word. It's a word that belongs to us. It doesn't belong to atheists. It has no meaning for them. It doesn't belong to secularists. But it does belong to us, and therefore we need to in my view, promote the holiness of matrimony. I think you need to do that with regard to your marriage preparation. I'd always encourage couples who are living together to withhold themselves sexually from the time of my first appointment to the time of their marriage. I want your sexual union on your marriage night to be special, and to deprive yourself of that between now and then. If you want to come and receive God's blessing, you haven't followed God's demands this point in time. Now's the time when you can actually put that into action and gain the fruit of that in a properly solemnised relationship where God is blessing you into the future. One of the greatest damages in our modern world into marriage is, of course, the nature of divorce. And this is a very big issue. And he looks at his watch. Okay. Which we will deal with briefly. Okay. There's what's called an indissolubilist position, which is that marriage is permanent and cannot be dissolved, and therefore you can't marry a second person unless the dissolution takes place at death. So a widowed person can remarry after from widowhood onward. The indissoluble position is taken on in my view, an erratic reading of Matthew, the exception clause with regard in Matthew 5. But my own view is that Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 make it clear that the teaching of Jesus here is that there is an exception with regard to what he broadly describes as porneia, except for porneia. So in Matthew 5:31, whoever divorces his wife, let him give him a certificate of divorce, it is said. But I said to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of porneia, unchastity translated, or immorality, makes her an adulteress, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. That's what's sometimes referred to as the Matthean exception. Porneia, of course, is a broad term. It's not moikeia, which is the word for adultery. So he's not just looking at adultery, but he's actually looking at immorality. Immorality, in my view, would include fornication, so sexual activity before marriage. It would include homosexuality. It would include bestiality. It's a broad range of immorality, which Jesus sees as breaking the marriage bond. Theologically, the reason why porneia provides opportunity or a premise for divorce and remarriage is that the bond itself has been broken. Because of the weaving aspect of marriage, which consummates a marriage, that if that is defiled by the breaking, by having another sexual union with another person, then that is the fundamental rift that takes place. That's my understanding of why the distinction is there. That's the Matthean exception, and that is grounded in Deuteronomy 24. Just have to stop and think. Deuteronomy 24, which is a fascinating section, because it talks. Let me just read you this way: when a man takes a wife and marries her, if he then finds no favour in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and the word for indecency for the Hebrew scholars is eved davar, which means the nakedness of a thing, which is an epithet for sexual immorality. If he finds that unchastity or immorality, I think we could define it, and he writes her a bill of divorce and puts her in the hand and sends her out to his house, and she departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter husband dislikes her and writes her a bill of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends it out of his house, or if the latter husband dies, who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. The interesting thing here is this. Many people think that use the language that when a couple, if there's been adultery in a marriage, the innocent party is allowed to remarry. You probably heard that. But the guilty party is not allowed to remarry. That's actually in contravention of Deuteronomy 24, if you notice them. In Deuteronomy 24, it's the guilty party who actually goes off and remarries. Interesting, isn't it? And there is no condemnation for that. See, when a marriage actually breaks, it's broken for both of them. You can't say they're still married in God's sight, which is some kind of, I don't know what, some kind of evangelical jargon, which has no basis in Scripture. It's not. Marriage is a public institution. Marriage is public. Divorce must be public, in my view. I reckon, as a pastor in a congregation, if a couple divorce, it needs to be announced in church. How's that for putting an edge on things? Well, their marriage was public in church. Their divorce needs to be public in church. And we need to recognise if that divorce gives ground, because the state will give divorce on just 12 months separation, whether that divorce is a biblically mandated divorce which allows remarriage. So therefore, if you've got a guilty party, and if one wants to, I won't say the righteous person, because there's always two sides to a marriage. If the one who's been defiled by, the one whose wife has committed adultery, or vice versa the husband, if he divorces her, the marriage is over. They could come back together, but if she remarries another person, he can never come back to his first wife. You can't do the Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton scenario, okay? You can't come back. That's very important. And the reason is because they're defiled. It's an abomination. And if you look up Jeremiah 3:9, the language of abomination there is because you've not taken it seriously. The permanency of marriage. It's not like a swinging door you can come in and out and move back. It's very important, because when I was in Paris, and there was a man whose wife had left him, gone off with a minister, would you believe, in that particular situation, who was also married, and he was waiting for his wife to come back and repent and come back to him. I said, it's never going to happen. Not because she's not going to do it. Even if she did it, you can't come back. That, for him, was liberating, because he thought his job as a faithful husband, or now ex-husband, was to sit and wait for his wife. But she'd remarried. That bond is irrevocably broken. That freed him up to actually remarry, which he did, with the blessing of God, in my view. And I think it's very important to teach people that if the couple have separated, then I think the husband's responsibility is to wait patiently for the wife. That comes to 1 Corinthians 7:11, easy verse to remember, where if the two separate, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 11, he says, if to the married I give charge, not I but the Lord, but the wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does, let her remain single. Now the interesting word is, the word single in the Greek is agamos, which means unmarried. Fascinating. In other words, Paul's saying, you don't have to have the conjugal relationships. There's a distinction between separation and divorce. Divorce is separation with the right to remarry. Separation, biblically, is separation with no right to remarry. You must remain single or be reconciled. So when you're pastoring couples in divorce situations or separation situations, my advice is you need to say, don't get married, either of you, to someone else. Work on God's Spirit changing your hearts to bring you back into your original marriage bond when you gave vows till death us do part. Yes, there's been a disruption in that marriage now through sin and sinfulness on both parties, most likely. But once one of them marries, then you can never come back to the original marriage. And therefore, your counsel with regard to that. I can tell you an example where a man's wife left him, not only left him, committed adultery, gave up being a Christian. He had a right to remarry, in my view, which he subsequently did. And what do you know? His first wife repented, came back to her senses, and want to come back to her first husband. It's too late. No way that could happen. They try to work out relations with the children because there were children in this marriage. It's hard, even when you've got a legitimate right to divorce, doesn't mean you have to exercise it. That can be a hard word impartially in talking to people, but you don't have to exercise that right to divorce, which by that I mean with the right to remarry. Is that a question?
Yeah, it is. I have to ask you, sorry, I don't want to interrupt the flow, but you've been talking there about divorce and remarriage. Are you saying that once a divorce happens, they can't come back together, or only in the case of
No.
one partner's remarriage?
No, it's the second marriage that prevents coming back together.
So a divorce doesn't really...
Yes, we use the word divorce as a separation with the right to remarry. That's what divorce means. That's what it means in our state laws. That's what it means in the Bible. Separation, like 1 Corinthians 7:11, means a separation where you no longer are married, but neither do you have the freedom to remarry. That's the distinction that Paul is making. And the reason he does it, in my view, is Deuteronomy 24. Because once that happens, you can never restore the original relationship. Okay? See, in federal law here, 12-month separation gives you a right to divorce, and with that divorce gives you a right to remarry without being accused of bigamy. Whereas if you were to separate and not get the official sanction of divorce and you marry someone else, you're breaking the law by committing bigamy. Okay? So these things, divorce is the language of that right to remarry. And I haven't got time to go through, but the Pauline, what's called the Pauline privilege, is that if your spouse is not a Christian and does not want the marriage to continue, then you're free to remarry. So you've got Matthean exception in the Pauline privilege. Paul speaks of a situation beyond what Jesus is speaking, hence the language not the Lord but I. That's not a distinction of authority in what Paul's saying. It's a distinction of orbit of discourse where Jesus is speaking into a covenant community where people are married together. But Paul's now into a new situation where here's a couple, both non-Christians, one gets converted. Does the marriage continue or not? That's a new scenario from what Jesus is addressing in the Gospels. And Paul says you ought to work together. But if the unbelieving spouse doesn't want to continue, then you have got a right to separate and a right to remarry. You're not bound. But you should always be working towards the conversion of that spouse. So if your unbelieving spouse does not want to separate, then you should continue in that marriage. Just briefly, I've skipped over God's divorce of Israel there. The language of divorce is the language that God uses. So although in a fallen world, divorce can actually receive God's blessing. If God himself can exercise divorce of Israel, with a view, of course, to remarrying Israel, in a sense. So the language, it's not an evil word. And let me tell you, whenever you're preaching on divorce, and this may even be the case in this situation, I have no idea, you will 10 to 1, there'll be people in your congregation who are themselves divorced or will have a close family member who is divorced. And therefore it needs to be done very sensitively when you're dealing with these things. And you need to always have opportunity to talk about, if people want to come and talk to you about that, to do so in a way which would be helpful for them. The pastoral applications are, we can't undo the past. When you've got people coming to you for marriage preparation and one is divorced, you can't undo the past. You've got to work out whether the legitimate grounds for divorce have been satisfied. In my view, those are the two biblical grounds. Domestic violence may well be a ground for separation, but may not be a grounds for divorce. That's an issue you might want to reflect upon. You can't undo the past, but what we must do is deal with them in the present, but we can't bless adultery. This comes back to my earlier remarks with regard to what marriage is all about. It's about, and your role as a minister is that your singular role is to bless the couple. If you don't bless If you bless a couple who are not married in God's sight, then you're blessing adultery. And that's something you must not do. That in the end, if you have to choose to say no to a couple, then you need to do that. One of the hardest pastoral situations I had when I went to parish in Sydney, in Miranda, there was a youth leader, a Bible study leader, and he was engaged to a non-Christian girl. She'd been a Christian, but she'd given up the faith. And I was told about this, and there was a marriage date that had been set, and I was to the marriage. This caused me great concern because I didn't want to bless something which God could not bless. So it was and I took the view, this had been arranged under the previous minister. So I thought, therefore, I couldn't dishonour them by not allowing them to get married, but I wanted to make it plain to the church, particularly the young people, that this was not going to be the policy whilst I was the rector of the parish. What I did was, what are you going to do? How do you honour the couple and a previous commitment of a previous minister, and you come along with a new standard, which you believe you can't move from because it's the Bible's teaching? So my solution to that was recognising there are differences of points of view. And I'll tell you what, when you hold strong views, and I hold many strong views, you've got to recognise, you need to have what a good friend of mine calls epistemic humility, which means humility that you don't know everything and that you could actually be wrong on this. And that there are other Christians of integrity who hold a different view. Other friends of mine believe it's not optimal, but not sin for a Christian to marry a non-Christian. And I've got to recognise, well, if they've come to that view, reading the scriptures as I do, I'm going to allow them to hold that view. It's still not the view that I hold. So my solution in that case was I got a retired minister whose view was that he thought it was not sin to marry the couple. And I thought that was the solution for me to keep my integrity, but to keep an honour of a promise made to the couple. I interviewed the couple to make sure that this was the case. I explained my situation to them, that I wasn't able to marry them. They accepted that. 4 weeks before the wedding, the male fiancé was killed in a tragic accident. He was the Christian. The most difficult pastoral visit I had ever made was to the family of his fiancée, who weren't Christians, for the minister who'd refused to marry their daughter to come and visit them to offer condolence and comfort. It was the most difficult pastoral visit I've ever made. I remember sitting in the car praying earnestly, and I had other people praying for me as well, as I went to minister in Christ's love to a grieving family that their future son-in-law or their future husband had died, and who was telling them that the one who'd refused to marry them. Sometimes God puts you in that and gives you such strength or ability to say the right things. It was, I believe, a good pastoral visit. I was actually welcomed and understood, and I preached at the guy's funeral, and they were all there, and they were very warm towards me. I always thought, in God's providence, that she'd become a Christian. As far as I know now, that hasn't happened. It may happen in the future. But in the end, I've got to be true to what I believe God tells me to do as a minister. And even the prospective salvation of a soul is not going to be the criterion by which I make a decision. I've got to stand before God to honour him in every decision I make. Of course I want people to be saved, but I'm not going to go against God's laws in order for, shall I say, an evangelistic opportunity, which I think sells out the gospel. The discipline of love. We need to show love, just like I said last night to that the girl who was going to marry a non-Christian. And the discipline of love worked for her, and she was blessed by that. Not at the time. She was very angry at the time. But later, she came to see the discipline of love was exactly what she needed and what, for now, at this point in time, is very grateful for. I think I'll leave it there. The segue is really in terms of we can't bless what we can only bless what, that should be what God allows, sorry. We can only bless what God allows in 2.b there. Same-sex marriage is critical for a number of things. Most, for us as Christians fundamentally, because it is contrary to God's law and God's will. That's not going to wash with most non-Christian views because they don't care what the Bible says. Or they dismiss it like Kevin Rudd did, as David reminded us last night. But rather, but there are other reasons because it's good for society. And the whole provision of a family, a complementary parenthood of a man and a woman, a mother and a father, for a biological child is at risk. And that brings us into a whole range of issues. And I think David now, is that right? David, you're going to come and speak to us about the current situation before us as a nation. Okay? Thanks, David. Brian, do you want to stretch legs and things?
Yes. Just before you get up, stretch your legs, and before David and Mark come,